Welcome to tutorial 1.9. The assignment is explain how Descartes comes to the conclusion that in addition to mind, there is a completely different kind of substance in the world, body. In your answer, summarize both how Descartes argues that there are material bodies in the world, that there are entirely different from minds. I'm proposing this three-part answer. In the first paragraph, doing kind of introduction. Second paragraph, sort of outlining Descartes' options for arguments, what he could say, and then talking about finally Descartes' use of revelation and also deductive reasoning. I'll explain all this stuff in the tutorial, but here it is in much the same way as his argument for the existence of mind. When Descartes argued for the existence of body, he relied on revelation. Divine revelation, revelations from God, something like this. Descartes did not have access to theories about human evolution and cognitive science. He did his best, did the best he could with the resources available. And then finally, to argue that material bodies exist, he applied deductive reasoning to divine revelations found in Catholic tradition in the Bible. Something about that. So here's the outline that I'm proposing, starting with the introduction. Descartes defended mind-body dualism, meaning the mind exists as a soul and is distinct from material things. To argue that there are material bodies in the world, Descartes applied deductive logic to divine revelations about the world, so-called divine revelations, right? So I'm putting it in brackets. You can say this in multiple ways so that you're not committing to saying that divine revelations are necessarily a real thing. Okay, you might believe them, but just we would write it probably with quotation marks or something like this, or some other disclaimer. Descartes' reliance on revelation may be a symptom of the resources he had available. To discuss the brain-body relation with greater accuracy, you would have needed, something. Familiarity with some kind of science, modern scientific discovery, something like this would have helped him. Given his limitations, Descartes relied on his understanding that God created all things and God is all good or perfect, something like this. To argue that material bodies exist, blank, he gave some arguments you could go through. One premise being that God would not deceive, and that's a pretty common one that he talks about how God's not a deceiver. Okay, and in the first paragraph, defining mind-body dualism, I think it's a good idea. No matter what you're going to do for your outline, I would say defining the main concept is important to do at the beginning. Arguments for mind-body dualism. Mind-body dualism means mind is constituted differently than body. The Cartesian mind is like spirit or soul. Descartes' proofs for the existence of mind utilize divine revelations. That's what we went through in the last tutorial. And Descartes' proofs for the existence of material bodies also utilize divine revelations. Revelations about God. What is God? God's a creator God. God's perfect. All these kind of things are, we would say, revealed. Can we see them in the world? Kind of. You can observe the world and come to that conclusion. But generally speaking, it's a revelation that God's a creator God and God is all good or perfect or something like that. That's a revelation. So it's not necessarily deductive or inductive logic that draws you to that conclusion. So let's differentiate induction, deduction, and revelation. In inductive reasoning, through empirical observations, we draw conclusions. This is inductive inference. Sensations induce ideas and ideas induce judgment. That's where we can track how it's inductive as opposed to deductive in this inducing. And even science utilizes induction to draw strong conclusions. Here's a scientist observing things and coming to conclusions. An inductive conclusion is probable, and it's based upon the given evidence. It's not guaranteed like deductive reasoning. Let's go through deductive reasoning. I have 5 apples is a claim that you could make. Therefore, I have 2 apples. That follows necessarily from you having 5. The conclusion, I have 2 apples, does not introduce any new information. The conclusion is, we say, already contained within the premises. Deductions thus start with one big claim that contains many implied facts. Deductive arguments deduct or subtract from the large claim to make smaller claims. That's how we contract what deductive means. Here's another example. George walked home straight down the main street to school, straight down the main street to school. Therefore, George walked past his teacher's house. Proposition B is contained within proposition A. Let's look at Descartes' deductive logic proving the existence of a thinking thing, of the mind. I think is his premise, and I think implies self-awareness, existence. Neurons are firing, we would say now. But I think is a claim that has a lot of smaller claims contained within it. Therefore, I exist follows because it's already said, it's already implied when you said you think that you exist. So the conclusion is contained within the premise for this argument. He also utilizes divine revelation. So just very briefly, obviously in the Bible, it's teaching in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, things like this about God is this creator God, and God is all good, God is perfect. Those things are found in the Bible, in Catholic tradition that Descartes was drawing from. Meditation 6, section 10 or paragraph 10, God is not a deceiver, and the argument is roughly our objects must exist because to say otherwise would be to suggest that God is a deceiver, and God is not a deceiver because God's a perfect being, however we want to say that. And he repeats this argument. So the revelation is that God is all good, perfect being kind of thing. Another revelation is God created all things. How do we know that God created all things? I mean, you could infer it from induction, but generally, it's a revelation. God revealed this to us, that God created us. So you apply this deduction. This all good God wouldn't purposely deceive his created beings. That's his deduction. And St. Augustine had already said this. God is not a deceiver. Already been said. And Descartes kind of borrowing from a lot of people in his arguments. He doesn't give credit very often, though. Descartes' deductive logic, then, applied to divine revelations. God the creator is good, is the first premise. And that has a lot of smaller claims contained within it. If you're saying God is this good creator that creates, all the earth, all the universe, all people. One implication, God makes souls immortal. God does not deceive. God makes us capable of knowing. All of those things are sort of implied. So he's saying, therefore, God does not deceive, and therefore material bodies exist, right? These material things exist. God's not just creating a being and tricking them into thinking that things exist. They actually exist. So God does not deceive follows from this: God is a creator. And God, the creator, is good is an unfalsifiable claim, though. It's a revelation. How do we know that God's the creator? How do we know God is all good? All these things those are revelations. Those are also unfalsifiable. So the premise is unfalsifiable. And we'll go through why that's a problem. And it's impossible to therefore verify the soundness of the conclusion. Therefore, God is not deceived. How do we verify that? We can't falsify this claim, so there's a problem with it. So let's go through this tangent about how we could misuse deduction. Here's a claim. The COVID vaccine is very slow-acting poison. That's poison vaccine. What's the implications? Well, there's an evil pharma company that produced it. Inject it and you die. Course injections are evil. So you could say, following from poison vaccines, therefore using any form of coercion to get me to inject the poison vaccine is evil. There's a deductive logic. The problem with it is that what is slow acting? What do we mean slow acting? Like, when is it gonna, like, in 100 years, when? It's not clear. Poison, what do we mean by poison? If you're just saying vaguely poison, how do we falsify your claim? Give us something concrete, and then we could falsify it and we could test it. Okay, so if you come to this conclusion then that it's evil to inject it in me or coerce me into injecting it, that's not necessarily the case. Coerce injection might be evil, but not because of this premise. That premise is unfalsifiable. Okay, so that's a problem. So thing about deductive reasoning is the usefulness of a deductive argument depends on the usefulness of the starting claim. Sometimes you can have valid logic still, but it's not a good argument. So we would call that unsound, where you have valid logic, but you have false premises. And I would say you can have unconfirmable soundness, which means that you have a valid argument, but your claim, your premise is unfalsifiable. So I'm saying Descartes has valid logic, but his premise is unfalsifiable. The premise that there's an all-good, all-powerful creator God, and this God is solely responsible for the way we are and the way the world is. So let's go back to Descartes. Another argument, section 10. There's this God-given inclination. God has given me a very strong inclination to believe that those ideas arise from corporeal objects. The deduction that's implied. Corporeal objects exist because a good creator God would give us a strong inclination to believe in corporeal objects. So that's essentially saying, again, that God doesn't deceive. And Thomas Aquinas had already talked about natural inclinations, and Descartes, again, is drawing from Aquinas and other scholastic theologians or scholars. So here's his logic here. God, the creator of people, is good. So God is a good creator of people. So there's these implications of that. Therefore, God gave people a strong inclination to trust their senses. So material objects must exist. That's the conclusion is contained within the premise. It's deductive logic, but it's applied to this unfalsifiable claim about God. How do we know? How do we know that? We can't falsify. Okay. Section 17, or paragraph 17. The human body, like a clock, is formed by its creator, God, for the sake of the motions which it usually manifests. Descartes implies that material things exist because God created them to exist physically. In other words, God would want to enjoy his handiwork. Now, that's roughly based on Revelation again, and it's interesting logic. Let's look at it. God is a good creator. A good creator would want to enjoy their handiwork is the implication, and that apparently follows. Therefore, there's this deductive logic, but it's applied to this revelation. Putting that all together then, reviewing what I'm suggesting for the outline. Introducing Descartes' conclusion first, in much the same way as his argument for the existence of mind. When Descartes argued for the existence of body, he relied on revelation. Second paragraph, Descartes did not have access to theories about human evolution and cognitive science. He did the best he could with the resource available. And then finally, to argue that material bodies exist, he applied deductive reasoning to divine revelations found in Catholic tradition in the Bible. Here's the outline, what it looks like. Descartes defended mind-body dualism in defining, first, meaning the mind exists as a soul and is distinct from material things. To argue that there are material bodies in the world, Descartes applied deductive logic to divine revelations about the world. Descartes' reliance on revelation may be a symptom of the resource he had available. To discuss brain-body relation with greater accuracy, he would have needed, some kind of scientific discoveries that hadn't been available to him. Given his limitations, Descartes relied on his understanding that God created all things and God is all good. To argue that material bodies exist, he went through these different arguments, which I've outlined for you. So hopefully that helps you out, and thanks for your time.